Dissect, your destination for information. Today we're talking about Greenland and why it's more complex than it seems. A lot of news outlets have covered this. I do not think that they go into enough detail. I think that they copy each other, and I don't think they're accurate enough. Therefore, I'm writing this, and I want to give people a more informed view of what is happening and the factors surrounding it. It is, of course, limited in what it covers, and I'll mention why it's limited at the end as well. Now, a lot of people have covered this article before. I think a lot of analysts are copying each other and they're quite shallow in their answers. One of my favorite sources, however, was from Bloomberg, which went into a lot of detail. Now, honestly speaking, if tomorrow push comes to shove, I think the US would win in a military intervention. The US military spends huge amounts of money in their military, which is barely anything compared to the other European countries. And furthermore, European military technology is so far advanced that it is very difficult to predict how even armies with so-called, large budgets and large numbers would fare against the US military. Example being, to see this in effect, was some of the two largest armies, Russia and China, which provided military goods to Venezuela, were forced to witness complete failure when none of their equipment worked. So yeah, clear and simple, that's out of the way. Next point, I don't think this is a Trump or a MAGA issue. I think this is something that repeatedly comes up in American history. This is actually the third time the US has attempted to acquire Greenland, and both sides of the political spectrum have attempted it. Both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. The Whig Party being a precursor to the Republicans. Next point, I don't think this is about resources. A lot of the analysts covering this have focused on the Middle East, and they've looked at the Middle East through this resource lens, resource resource-rich lens, and they try to apply a similar thing to Greenland. I don't think that's the right thing to do because the geography is completely different, and the cost associated with acquiring those resources is completely different. For those of you interested, you can look at the CIA website to find out what resources Greenland has. Right, I move on now and I officially begin. Now, first of all, we had to start off with the Donner Doctrine, which is essentially a revival of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The Monroe Doctrine essentially stated that the United States would not involve itself in American conflicts so as long as Europe keeps itself out of the Western Hemisphere and not try to make another colony over there. The idea of the Monroe Doctrine was brought back to life in the National Security Strategy of the United States of America, a document that was published in November 2025. Honestly, the document is a great read and covers a lot of things. Here's a table of the contents. It can really help understanding a lot of different theaters and a lot of different situations the US is currently working with. But I want to bring attention to this page over here. Essentially, in the Western Hemisphere, the Trump administration wants to enforce the Monroe Doctrine again and quote unquote return and restore American prominence in the Western Hemisphere, i.e., they want to have control of everything in the Western Hemisphere for pretty much for safety and economic reasons as well. Point here, big caveat here, the Western Hemisphere is pretty much the Americas and a bit of Greenland. It's not the Western world or Western civilization, nothing like that at all. Western Hemisphere simply means the Americas. A good rule of thumb is to look at America, look top down on the map, and that's your Western Hemisphere. No, no UK, no nothing. And that's what the US administration is currently afterwards. This is a great read, and I'll put it in the description below. Now, I want to revisit American history and culture. I think it's really important to understand the nuance of the American culture, to understand modern day behaviors in foreign affairs that we're currently seeing. So, first of all, America is very familiar with the purchase of sovereign land. It's something that has led to their economic growth significantly. It's been, some people argue it's been the reason why they are the most powerful country in the world. Starting off with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, in which the United States government bought this huge chunk of land from France for 72 cents per acre, which is ridiculously cheap even for that time period. It was a steal, and it gave them access to two mountains either side of the region, Rocky Mountains on the left and the another set of mountains on the right. Along with that, it also gave access. Now, in doing this purchase, America acquired one of the most dense waterways in the world. It gained a network of canals, of waterways that connected the eastern side of the US to the western side. Water transportation is much cheaper than land travel, and it allowed economies on either side of the nation to connect with each other, and also allowed for far more, led to an exports boom towards Europe, especially of Western goods. It was far easier now for Western goods to go to the eastern side and be sent over to Europe, leading to economic success and economic growth within the US. Now, there's one example of sovereign land which was purchased and is very well known to Americans. They know it quite well. I assume that the average person in the UK or Europe may not immediately know of this unless they do some further reading. Now, the next transaction I want to bring to mind is the year that was the Alaskan Purchase. In 1867, Andrew Johnson and the Secretary of State, William Seward, purchased Alaska for just a mere 2 cents per acre, which was a steal. At that time, the Russians were at risk of losing Alaska to the UK because of the Crimean War. In order to exit cleanly, they decided to sell the land off to the US, which the president at the time accepted. The president and the Secretary of State were berated by the press. In fact, the Alaska was given a dirty nickname of Sevett's Folly, which essentially just means that it is a useless land, and that was said for several years until 9.6 million barrels of oil were found in Alaska, and it was deemed a huge success. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the president Andrew Johnson is remembered. It's one of the things that puts him down in history books. Some historians would also argue that he was the worst person to put after the Civil War. Bear in mind, this is the president who came after Abraham Lincoln, but that's a separate issue. And oftentimes, the greatness of this purchase is so great that people talk about it much more. So the point I'm trying to make here is that in the US, purchasing sovereign land that benefits the country often puts one's name in the history books, and also, leads to a long-term benefit for the nation. Americans are comfortable buying sovereign land. It's something they've done throughout. I've just given a few examples on Alaska and the Louisiana Purchase. Another example would be the Danish territory islands that were just off the coast of the US, which was also done in about 1911, 1912 for security reasons. Essentially, the US didn't want the Germans to buy that land, so they made another purchase over there. Now, the thing is, since the birth of the United Nations, um, borders are frozen in time, and the real estate market for sovereign land has been a bit of a slump. And so it's not very common anymore, which is why people on the European side and perhaps even the American side are a little bit taken aback that this option is still available. But nonetheless, it's something that was done historically. Um, it had good reason to be done. It led to a lot of improvements and a lot of changes and a lot of developments. Uh, and theoretically, it's still possible today. Now, enough about the US. Let's zoom into Greenland, where things get really interesting. Now, Greenland is the largest island in the world. What's crazy about it is that there is there's so much ice that the average thickness of Greenland's ice sheets is 1 mile, and if it were all to be melted, the global sea levels would rise 7 meters, which is around 2 stories, which is ridiculous, given how big the oceans are. Now, this all being said, Greenland has natural resources. It has cobalt, it has iron, it has uranium, a lot of nice stuff. But it's very expensive to extract. In fact, if one were to do an operation, mining operation in Greenland, it might cost $5 to $6 billion, whereas in Australia it would only cost 1 to 2. In fact, this difference is so big that it's currently economically unviable to extract any resources in Greenland. It just simply doesn't make any economic sense. The US has far better options, such as Peru, which is also in the Western Hemisphere, where they can work to get resources. It'd be a better use of resources and time. It'll also not risk European relations being uh, damaged as well. So that's namely why I think the Greenland acquisition is not really about resources. Anyways, I move on and I want to bring in focus. I've done the land, now I want to bring in focus to the population of Greenland and some of their thoughts. Now, 80 to 90% of Greenland is Inuit. And what makes it really interesting is the inequalities between the Danes in Denmark and Greenlanders. So I'm not getting into anything too deep yet, but to give some picture on some of the issues going on between the two nations, we can look at things like the suicide rate. Greenland has the highest suicide rate in the entire world, while Denmark remains to be one of the happiest countries in the world. It was so bad that the suicide rate in Greenland once went to around 400 per 100,000. Right now, it sits at around 80, and Denmark stays somewhere near 10 or 11 per 100,000. So it is a ridiculous inequality of life that can be, immediately seen just through the suicide rates of the two countries. And I feel a lot of European media doesn't pick it up. I'm unsure about any other media, but this is something which becomes immediately apparent when you're studying this topic and reading about it, and it's genuinely shocking. Furthermore, a lot of Greenlanders, especially the Inuits, will often talk about a feeling of discrimination when they're in Denmark. If you search online and you try to talk to this community, you try and look at their comments on Denmark, you will see this feeling repeated again and again. There's this sense or this notion that that Greenlanders are lesser than the Danes in Denmark, and people say they feel that when they visit. Culturally, that was seen as well in I think it was the 20th century, when Denmark thought it would be a good idea to take people from Greenland, the Inuit populations, force them to learn Danish, never taught them their home, their native tongue, and would then send them back to be what they would call little Danes. In the end, they could no longer communicate with their families. They lost complete touch with their culture, and it caused a huge amount of trauma and psychological stress uh, on these families, because of Denmark's existing idea that they are better. So this um, relationship between Greenlanders and Denmark is quite frayed, to be quite honest, and efforts are being made to bring them together. But I think at the base, it becomes quite apparent um, that there are some deep issues between the two. Bear in mind that you know this is quite a this is a culture that has dealt with the Danish for over 1,000 years. Uh, Starting with Erica the Red, a murderer from a Scandinavian nation who had gone to Greenland and then came back 3 years later with more people. It was a huge cycle, which I don't want to go into, but the most recent colonization that you need to know about is the one of 1812, which leads to a lot of the issues that we see today. Denmark is essentially colonizing Greenland till this day, and European media often talk about it being the Kingdom of Denmark, where honestly it's just a colony. It's as much of Denmark as South Africa belongs to the UK or Australia belongs to the UK, but even more nuanced, because this time the majority of the population isn't British, but actually it's indigenous, and it still is, which makes it quite an interesting and rather tragic reality to encounter. But efforts are still being made. I have to put that out there. So something that they're toxic and they're marred with scandals. I can't go into all of them, all of the scandals, all of the issues, but I will go into the Coil scandal, which is still an ongoing investigation. So in 2014, it was found that over 4,000 Greenlander Inuit women were made infertile by the Danish government. This was against their consent. They wouldn't even know it was done to them. They may have gone for a different surgery or a different operation or whatnot. And the government would force these contraceptives into these women, some of them being as young as 12. And the main idea was to control the Inuit populations and to stop them from growing. Um, this was done in the 70s and 80s, so not even that long ago. The people affected are still alive, and you can still talk to them. They're still part of these discussions that we see today, and it's crazy that that was done. Very very sad, and it's had a huge effect on politics as well. So you'd see people, like Greenlander politicians, coming in to Denmark, talking in the native language as a sense of rebellion. Uh, you know, uh, among other things. But it just goes to show how marred relations are between the two. They appear positive on the surface, but there is a general sense that that the Greenlanders want to move towards their own independence. And just to put a bit more context on that issue, it was in 2014 the crime was made public. It was in public knowledge. But Trump comes into power January 25, and it was only in August 2025 that the PM of Denmark decided it's time to apologize, when talks of the acquisition of Greenland were brought up again. So it really is odd to see in a modern European country to see all this behavior exercised. And I think the dates and the actions speak a lot louder about the relations than I could ever describe in other words. And this could potentially be a political point that could be exploited by the US if they want to. Uh, I'm not a sociological analyst, sociological analyst, so I can't comment on how effective it would be. But it's something on the table and something to be taken into point in these discussions as Denmark talks about its kingdom. Now, of course, Denmark did give something called the right to self rule in 2009, which essentially states that if Greenland so wants it, they can take independence. They're free to do so. There's nothing stopping them. That's what it's on paper, but behind the scenes, Denmark gives €500 million every single year, which makes up half of the Greenland budget. The Greenlanders rely on Denmark for schools, hospitals, buses, and all other sorts of things you'd expect to be paid for by taxes. So it makes them highly dependent, and I don't think countries are altruistic enough to give $500 million every year for altruistic purposes. I think essentially, in my opinion, that Denmark is buying a call option on Greenland's natural resources. I mentioned before that it's currently economically unviable to extract those resources, but I think in 15 to 30 years, when market prices for these resources go up, when people prefer more domestic supply chains, demand for the resources in Greenland may go up to a point where it becomes economically viable to extract. And Denmark is buying the right, but not the obligation to extract those resources by having this grip on Greenland, this financial grip on Greenland. Uh, yeah, and of course, it's to have a seat at the Arctic as well and have a seat at those discussions. We'll of course discuss that in more detail shortly. Now, in terms of Greenlanders who actually want independence, a famous quote quoted in almost all the media outlets is this 56%. It's a number of Greenlanders who want independence today. The quote, the statistic comes from the source called Varian, a data analytics company from Denmark, which I think already introduces some sense of bias. And essentially, the question asks in detail, if a referendum were held today on Greenland's independence, would you vote yes or no to Greenland becoming an independent state? 56% answered yes, which seems like a small number given everything I've just told you. However, it doesn't take, however, given the framing of the question that a lot of the media outlets are quoting, it doesn't take into account people who may want independence in the long term and who who understand that taking independence immediately today would result in adverse economic effects. So I think the question itself that media outlets are using is just plain wrong and is not really reflective of the true sentiment of Greenlanders in an emotional way and in an economically rational way. This question basically only captures people who wish to forfeit all the economic benefits today because they believe in it so much. It only captures the hardcore independence seekers. Now, I moved to the next statistic from that same source, which was 85% of Greenlanders do not want to be part of the US, published by the same data analytics company from Denmark. Now, again, there's quite a lot. The issue with this is that the question immediately assumes that Greenlanders would become a part of the US and would not become a special territory like Puerto Rico or another region that the US has a control over. They doesn't the question itself doesn't allow Greenland to be a sovereign nation like the reservations within the US, for example, in the way those work, and it enforces the idea that that this must become the 51st state, which is obviously the least likely of things to happen should the US acquire the land. So again, this is just my thoughts on why I think news outlets' quotation of the statistic is missing nuance. So I go back to the idea and summarize it. Countries do not give 8.5 billion euros for charity, which is the amount they would have given this year, including numbers from 2009 onwards. And I think there's more to play, which I'm going to go into now. I mentioned the Arctic, and now I'm going to go into it deeper. So the Arctic, the Arctic is where we start. There's a huge desire for domination in the Arctic. I've got here a picture of icebreakers around the world. Russia has an insanely large amount, and they've been doing this since the 2010s, the mid late 2010s. They've been trying to build this huge fleet because they want to essentially an icebreaker breaks ice, okay, and then another ship can go behind it, like a consumer ship or a military ship, whatever. Russia, a good proxy to understand how invested people are would be to look at this. Russia has a huge number of shipbreakers. Compare that to the United States, which only has, you know, five, of which one of them is not really that. Some of them aren't even that good because they're so old. You know, obviously take this table into caveat with the idea that Russia is actually an Arctic state and hence it has an interest, and China isn't really an Arctic state and that's why it has less, for example. Anyways, my research focuses on China, even though Russia is really important to look at. I highly advise you look at it. So China, why is it involved in this whole business with Greenland? In 2018, China self-proclaimed itself as a near Arctic state. This was written in their Arctic policy of 2018. Essentially, they argued that they are, quote unquote, near the Arctic state, and therefore they should have a say in Arctic policy. The truth of the matter is that they're about as close to the Arctic as other European nations. Some European nations could even argue that they're closer. Spain is closer to the Arctic than China. So, so this is why this term is quite disputed by analysts. It's a term that was made up, but it's still official policy in China, and it's been a cause for concern for other superpowers. Highly recommend reading the article, by the way, this policy that they've written up. I'll put a link to that in the bio as well, in the description as well. Now, I want to show you two maps of why China is interested in the Arctic. This this shows two routes with two spears. They're both the same route from different angles. One passes through, well, actually, the different routes, sorry, but they both pass through the polar region. One passes through the polar region, one passes through the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. And not sure it's immediately visible, but the polar route is significantly shorter. Now, of course, I just wanted to take a look at some of the routes the Arctic offers. Now, there's three over here. One is the Northwest Passage, one's the Northeast Passage, and one's the Northern Sea Route. Take a note how a lot of these routes pass through Arctic nations. This is mentioned in China's Arctic policy that this causes issues with those nations. Obviously, it does. I mean, who wouldn't be Who wouldn't be, having an issue with that? And so that's thing to bear in mind. Anyway, these are the options that China can currently take. Ignore the blue line for a moment. Now, China saves 4,300 miles traveling to the Arctic to reach Europe and saves 1 week of travel time. China argues that as climate change worsens, as the world gets warmer and hotter, that there'll be a future route called the trans-Arctic shipping route. Essentially, it cuts tighter through the North Pole. It has less geopolitical issues associated with it, and actually can save up to 40% in fuel. So these are some of the strong motivations for China having an interest in the Arctic. Further to that, given movements in Taiwan and other interests that the Chinese may have, which the US may oppose, the Arctic forms a hedge. Passing through the Panama, for example, in the Western Hemisphere, China faces a risk that their ships may one day be sanctioned by the US. The US may put pressure on Panama to put sanctions on the US. That's a geopolitical risk for China, which they can avoid by going to the Arctic currently. There's no real US threat over there. And it's very hard to fight a war on a base that belongs to another country. It has a lot of geopolitical issues attached to it. Hence being a catalyst for US interest in Greenland. Now, I have to be honest, the amount of interest, the amount of ships that have passed through the Arctic that are Chinese has been relatively small. In fact, it's been 7, 11, and 14 in 2023, 2024, and 2025, respectively, which is not a lot, but it is growing. And there are researchers saying that the number of days that the route can be used. So, for context, the Arctic route can only be used in summer, and that to only a few weeks at most in summer right now. It's increased over the years how long it can be used, and it's expected to increase further, which is why China maintains an interest. But China's playing the waiting game for ice caps to melt so we can start using that route to start shipping goods to Europe. So, in conclusion, over there, China's interests in the Arctic are strong and motivated, and should push come to shove tomorrow, Greenland forms a place where the United States can exert pressure on the Chinese or the Russians, should they so choose to do so, or any other adversaries who may benefit from the Arctic. Greenland is also the place where any missiles from Russia have to pass through to reach the US. I'm not a geopolitical analyst. I'm not a military analyst or a missiles expert, so I can't. I'm not sure why Russia can't just fire something across the Bering Strait. Why it must go over Greenland? But this is something I've read a lot, and essentially it's one of the reasons why the US has a base out there as well. People argue that as technology improves, the US will have to create a bigger base. Denmark argues that the US can just have more people there and increase the base size. But like I said before, should push come to shove, should military action be needed, it may be quite hard for the US to start a conflict on foreign soil, especially a friendly soil. So those are the key points I've covered. In this video, I've covered the history of the US and their culture with sovereign expansion. I've covered Chinese motivations. I've covered some of the relations between Greenlanders and Denmark as well. There are a lot of limitations to this video, and it misses out on a lot of important points. It misses out on the effects that this story may have on US-NATO relations. It misses out on effects that this may have on Russia-Ukraine. It touches a little bit about Taiwan, but Taiwan, how it links to Greenland, Greenland's interests, and it completely misses out on Russia, its influence in the region. It misses out on Chinese investments in Greenland. It misses out on it misses out on other options that the US has, such as a greater Greenland interest militarization in the area, and the other options, which I think are really important to read and understand. But I just couldn't include them because of time and the amount of time it takes to research and add this stuff in. But I think these are big limitations which are very important to understand, and I should be including them in a future video if possible. I'd really appreciate if you guys can tell me in the comments what you think are the biggest rational drivers for the US acquisition of Greenland. And I really appreciate you all for sticking through this video and seeing all of it. And like every YouTuber says, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much.